night crept over the small neighborhood. Outside, the wind carried dry leaves through the deserted streets, creating a whispering sound that barely broke the heavy silence inside the house. The dim light of a hanging bulb flickered occasionally, as if it was too tired to continue illuminating the mess. Daniel stood leaning against the doorframe, his tall and slender silhouette contrasting with the chaos that dominated the interior. His face, marked by exhaustion, showed a mix of sadness and determination. He wore a wrinkled shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his fists were clenched as he observed the disorder around him. The furniture was covered in dust, dirty dishes piled up in the sink, and on the kitchen table rested several empty bottles, silent witnesses to the endless nights of despair. His eyes landed on Clara, his wife, who was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall. Her face was gaunt, her eyes lifeless, and her once shiny, long hair now fell in messy strands around her face. In one trembling hand, she held a glass of whiskey, and in the other, a half-smoked cigarette. Her gaze was the reflection of a battle lost long ago. "You're going to leave, aren't you?" Clara asked in a hoarse and broken voice, without even looking up. Her tone wasn't one of surprise but of resignation. She had known this moment would come sooner or later. Daniel swallowed hard, the lump in his throat preventing him from speaking. He looked at his daughter, little Sofía, who was peacefully sleeping on the couch. Her curly hair fell in soft loops over her cheeks, and her small arms tightly hugged an old teddy bear, faded from use. Every breath the girl took was calm, unaware of the chaos surrounding her. Daniel's heart ached, the pain unbearable. "I can't stay here anymore, Clara," he finally murmured, his voice laden with a mixture of anger and sadness. He took a step toward his daughter, leaning down slightly to gently stroke her soft, warm cheek. The girl sighed in her sleep but did not wake up. "And what about her?" Clara's voice cracked as she spoke, pointing to the girl with a slow movement of her hand. She let the glass slip from her hand, which rolled and stopped next to her bare foot. "You're going to leave her too?" "As if she didn't matter, as if I never mattered." Daniel closed his eyes, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. He had fought so hard to keep this family together, but Clara had sunk too deeply into her vices. Every night was a fight, an argument, or worse yet, absolute silence, the most painful of all. The alcohol had consumed her, turning her into a shadow of the woman he had once loved. "It's not that I don't care, Clara," he finally replied, opening his eyes and looking at his wife with deep sorrow. "It hurts more than you can imagine. But I can't stand watching you destroy yourself anymore, and dragging Sofía along with you. She deserves something better. I can't do anything for you anymore." Clara let out a bitter laugh, a harsh sound that echoed in the empty room. "And you think you can give her something better by leaving?" she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You're such a coward, Daniel. You're leaving because it's easier than staying and fighting. You know she needs me, and yet you're going to go." Daniel straightened up, swallowing the words he wanted to scream. He knew Clara wouldn't understand, that her mind was clouded by alcohol and despair. His daughter was the only thing keeping him tied to that house, but she was also the reason he had to leave. He couldn't continue to watch her grow up in an environment filled with chaos and pain. "I'll find a way to take care of her," he said with a tone that tried to sound firm but barely masked the fragility behind those words. "I don't know how, but I will." Clara shook her head, closing her eyes as if trying to block out reality. She knew Daniel was serious, but she no longer had the strength to hold him back. Alcohol had drained all her love, energy, and hope. Daniel leaned down once more toward his daughter, kissing her gently on the forehead. He stayed there, feeling her soft breathing, wishing he could stay. But he knew leaving was the only way to save Sofía. With a final sigh, he turned and walked out of the house. The night wind hit his face, but he couldn't feel emptier than he already was. As he closed the door behind him, he felt an invisible weight lift from his shoulders, but the void he left behind turned into a pain that would follow him for the rest of his life. The house was completely silent. Little Sofía shifted slowly on the couch, stretching her small arms toward the teddy bear she clung to as if it were the only thing offering her comfort in the empty space. The first rays of the sun filtered through the torn curtains, illuminating her innocent face. Her large, sleepy eyes blinked several times before she realized something was different. "Daddy," she whispered, looking around, but the silence responded with its hollow echo. The girl sat up, her hair tangled and her cotton nightgown wrinkled, as she stared at the closed door. She clumsily climbed down from the couch, the teddy bear dangling from her arm, and walked barefoot across the cold floor toward the kitchen. There, she found her mother, Clara, slumped over the table, with an empty bottle by her side and the cigarette burned down in the ashtray. Little Sofía looked at her with a mix of confusion and sadness. Although she didn't fully understand what was happening, she knew something was wrong. "Mommy," she called in a whisper, trying to wake her mother with gentle touches on her arm. "Where's Daddy?" Clara opened her eyes slowly, her gaze clouded by a hangover. The pain in her head was so sharp that it was hard for her to focus on her own daughter. With a groan, she sat up a little, trying to find her balance in the midst of dizziness. "Daddy's gone, sweetheart," she replied in a broken, bitter voice as she rubbed her temples. "He left us, like everything else in this damn life." Sofía didn't fully grasp the meaning of those words, but something in the way her mother said it, in the sadness of her voice, made her feel a knot in her stomach. She hugged her teddy bear tighter, as if it could give her some security amidst so much uncertainty. "Will he come back?" she asked, her big eyes filled with hope. She wanted her father to come back, to pick her up in his arms and make her laugh like before. Clara let out a bitter laugh, a sound that echoed in the empty room like a broken bell. She stood up unsteadily from the chair and walked to the sink, where she began washing some dishes without even looking at her daughter. "I don't know, Sofía. I don't know," she replied, letting the dishes clatter loudly into the water, while tears fought to escape from her eyes. She had lost count of how many times she had wished things were different, but now everything seemed irreparably broken. Sofía stood there, her heart pounding hard in her small chest. She didn't fully understand what her mother was feeling, but she knew that something had changed forever. Her world of games and laughter with her father now seemed like a bubble that had burst, leaving only the uncertainty of a future she couldn't imagine. "And if I'm good, Mommy? Will he come back if I'm good?" Sofía asked, her little voice trembling. In her innocence, she believed she could fix what was broken. Clara stopped, letting the water run senselessly over the dishes. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of those words. The little girl, unknowingly, had touched a deep chord in her, the same one that had been drowned in alcohol and sadness for years. "It's not your fault, Sofía," Clara finally said, turning toward her daughter and kneeling in front of her, cupping her small face in her hands. "It was never your fault. Daddy. Daddy has his own demons, and her voice broke, I didn't know how to fight mine." Sofía looked at her mother with eyes filled with tears but also with the pure misunderstanding that only children can have. She didn't understand why her mother was crying or why her father had left, but something in her little heart told her that her world would never be the same. "I promise I'll always be here for you, little one," Clara whispered, wiping away the tears that began to fall from Sofía's cheeks. "Even if Daddy's not here, I'll protect you, always." But as Clara said those words, she knew she was lying. Her life was as broken as the empty bottles that covered the table, and deep down, she feared she wouldn't be able to keep that promise. However, in that moment, it was the only thing she could offer her daughter, a fragile promise in a world full of uncertainty. Without knowing it, Sofía hugged her mother with all the strength her small body could give, seeking the comfort her teddy bear could no longer provide. Clara, for an instant, returned the embrace, feeling the warmth and love of her daughter, the same love that had been lost in her own despair. The rain was beating heavily against the windows of the small apartment where Clara and Sofía had spent their last days together. The walls were stained with dampness, and the cold seeped through the cracks in the poorly fitted windows. Clara, weak and increasingly consumed by her addiction, had stopped fighting. The spark of life that she once had long extinguished, leaving behind a broken woman, lost in an abyss of guilt and loneliness. Each day, her body grew more fragile, her skin paler, while little Sofía silently observed, learning to survive in a world she barely understood. Clara's sister, Teresa, arrived that gray morning. The relationship between them had always been tense, and Teresa had never approved of Clara's decisions. Since Clara had sunk into drinking, Teresa had kept her distance, visiting only out of obligation, and this visit was no different. The apartment smelled of a mix of alcohol, tobacco, and rotting food. Teresa frowned as she entered, kicking aside an empty bottle as she walked toward little Sofía, who was playing on the floor with scattered puzzle pieces. The girl looked up, recognizing her aunt, but showed none of the excitement typical of children seeing a loved one. It was as if Sofía already understood, even at her young age, that she couldn't expect much from anyone. Teresa. Clara mumbled from the couch, her voice weak and raspy. I can't do this anymore. I just can't. Teresa sighed, running a hand over her forehead. The exhaustion was clear in her eyes. She knew her sister was nearing the end, that Clara's body was succumbing to the ravages of alcohol, and that Sofía, now only 3 years old, would soon be left completely alone. You shouldn't have let it get this far, Clara, Teresa said harshly, though with a hint of sadness. She approached her sister and knelt to look her in the eyes. What did you think was going to happen? Look at your daughter, she gestured toward Sofía, still playing on the floor, immersed in her world of puzzle pieces. Do you think she deserves to grow up in this? Clara tried to respond, but a violent cough interrupted her. Teresa turned away, frustrated and helpless. She had never been close to her sister, and now, seeing her so fragile and broken, she wondered if she had ever been able to save her. I can't take care of her, Teresa. Clara said between ragged breaths. I can't be the mother she needs. Teresa remained silent, watching the child, her niece. She knew Clara was right. But she also knew that she wasn't in a much better situation herself. She could barely make ends meet with her job at the local store. She lived in a small apartment, with no room or resources to raise a child. Sofía, unaware of the adult conversation happening around her, began sorting the puzzle pieces, searching for the right way to make them fit. As she did, her eyes gleamed with a precocious intelligence, an innate ability to solve problems. Teresa observed the girl in silence for a few moments, noticing how focused she was, how calm she appeared in the midst of the chaos. She's smart, you know. Clara said, her voice weak and broken. Smarter than you think. I don't know where she got that strength from, certainly not from me. She doesn't have to get it from you, Teresa replied, her tone softening as she saw her sister's vulnerability. Kids, they find a way to survive. But she can't stay here, Clara. Not like this. A long silence filled the room. The sound of the rain against the windows was the only thing breaking the tense calm that had taken over both women. Finally, Clara nodded slowly, her eyes filled with tears that never fell. Take her, Teresa, she whispered. Take her far away from here. I have nothing left to give her. I can't keep watching her grow up in this place. Teresa looked at her sister for a long moment. There was a mixture of relief and guilt on Clara's face, as if that decision had brought her a sliver of peace but also an unbearable burden. Teresa didn't know if she was ready to take care of Sofía, but something inside her, perhaps the last remnant of family she had left, told her she had to try. All right, she responded with a heavy sigh. I'll take her. Sofía, hearing her name for the first time in the conversation, looked up. Her curious eyes met those of her mother and then her aunt's. She didn't understand what was happening, but the serious tone of the voices made her uneasy. She stood up slowly and approached Teresa, clutching her teddy bear tightly. Are we going somewhere, Aunt Teresa?" she asked innocently, her voice soft, almost afraid. Teresa knelt down, gently stroking her niece's hair with a tenderness she didn't often show. "Yes, Sofía. We're going to leave, far from here." Clara closed her eyes, allowing the repressed tears to finally escape. She knew this would be the last time she saw her daughter, but she also knew that the best thing she could do for her was to let her go. Teresa picked up the small suitcase she had brought, quickly packing Sophia's few clothes and some toys. With a final glance at Clara, she headed toward the door, holding the child's hand. The rain continued to fall heavily as both of them stepped outside, walking away from the only home Sofía had ever known. As they made their way to the car, Teresa couldn't help but think about the uncertain future that awaited her niece. She had no idea how she would manage the situation, but she knew she had to try. She had to offer Sofía something better than what her mother had been able to give. The car moved slowly along the wet streets, the windshield wipers struggling to keep the glass clear in the heavy rain. Teresa drove in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the road, though her thoughts were far away. In the back seat, Sofía watched the world outside through the foggy window, not fully understanding what was happening. The monotonous sound of the rain and the engine filled the void between them. "Where are we going, Aunt Teresa?" Sofía finally asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. It took Teresa a few seconds to respond. Her thoughts were tangled up in the difficult situation she was facing. She knew taking care of Sofía wouldn't be easy. Her own life was complicated enough, with a tiring job at the store and a small apartment barely big enough for herself. There was no room for a child, let alone one like Sofía, who required more than Teresa felt she could offer. "We're going to a place where they're better prepared to take care of you," Teresa finally said, her tone trying to sound reassuring but hiding the harshness of the decision she had made. Sofía frowned, confused by her aunt's words. She didn't understand what better prepared meant. All she knew was that they were getting farther and farther away from what she knew, and although her home with her mother had been a place of sadness and chaos, it was still the only thing she had known. The car continued its journey until, after several minutes, they arrived at a hill overlooking a gray, austere building. It was large and cold, surrounded by a tall wall and trees that seemed twisted under the weight of the rain. It looked more like a prison than a refuge, but Teresa knew there was no other option. She stopped the car in front of the entrance and turned off the engine. For a moment, the silence was unbearable, broken only by the constant drumming of the rain on the car roof. Teresa took a deep breath before turning to Sofía. "Listen, Sofía," she began, choosing her words carefully. "This is a place where many children go when their parents can't take care of them. Here, they'll treat you well, you'll have friends, food, and a place to sleep." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, struggling to maintain control of her emotions. I can't take care of you the way I should. I want you to understand that, sweetheart." Sofía looked at her with her big brown eyes, eyes that seemed to see beyond her aunt's words. She knew, in her young heart, that this wasn't temporary. Though she couldn't grasp all the complexities of the adult world, there was a feeling in her chest that told her her life was about to change forever. "Can't I stay with you?" she asked, her voice so soft it was barely heard over the rain. Teresa felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to lie, to tell her that this was only temporary, that one day she would pick her up again. But she knew she couldn't. She knew that once Sofía walked through those doors, it would be the last time she saw her. Her life didn't allow for more complications, and taking care of a child was a responsibility she wasn't prepared to handle. "No, Sofía," she said, her eyes filled with a pain she had tried to suppress the entire drive. "I can't. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Sofía lowered her gaze, clutching her teddy bear tightly to her chest, her only source of comfort in that moment. Her aunt's words echoed in her mind, but she didn't have the capacity to fully process their meaning. All she knew was that she was being left behind, again. First her father, then her mother, and now her aunt. "It's okay," she finally whispered, her voice barely holding its own weight. She didn't fully understand why this was happening, but she knew there was nothing she could do to change it. Teresa pressed her lips together, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She knew this was the right thing for both of them, but that didn't make it any less painful. Without saying another word, she opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. Sofía followed silently, her small feet splashing in the puddles that had formed on the asphalt. Teresa led her to the main door, where a stern but kind-looking man greeted them. He wore a dark raincoat, and his hands were clasped behind his back as he observed them. With a slight nod, he understood what was happening. "This is Sofía," Teresa said, handing him a small bag with the girl's few belongings. "She's here to stay." The man nodded and took the bag. He looked at Sofía with a soft but professional gaze. He knew what it meant to be left there, he had seen it too many times. "Welcome, Sofía," the man said with a kind, though forced, smile. He extended his hand toward her. "Come, I'll show you your new home." Sofía looked at Teresa one last time, hoping something would change, that her aunt would decide to take her back. But Teresa kept her gaze lowered, unable to meet the weight of the child's eyes. "Goodbye, Sofía," Teresa murmured, her voice choked with guilt and pain. Sofía nodded slightly, without words. She took the man's hand and followed him inside the building, not looking back. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, and with that, another chapter of her young life ended. Teresa stood in the rain for a moment longer, unable to move. She knew she had done the right thing, but the emptiness she felt in her chest made her doubt. Finally, she turned and walked back to the car, not caring about the rain soaking her clothes. She had done what she had to, but she knew she would never fully forgive herself. The cold winter had settled into the children's home, filling the hallways with a chill that the old heaters could barely combat. The windows, covered in a layer of frost, let in a pale, cold light, making the inside of the building seem even more desolate. The place was permeated with a constant sense of loneliness, even though there were always children running, playing, or crying in some corner. It was a world apart, where each little soul had their own story, marked by abandonment, loss, and, in some cases, oblivion. Sofía, now 6 years old, had learned to navigate this world with a maturity far beyond her years. Her natural intelligence and adaptability allowed her to stand out among the other children. Always quiet, always observant, she had become a kind of silent leader among the younger kids, who, without knowing why, felt drawn to her calmness and willingness to help. She didn't complain, didn't cry, and although she was often seen alone, playing with the puzzle pieces she loved so much, she was always ready to console others. One afternoon, as the wind howled outside and the snow fell in thick flakes that gathered at the window edges, Sofía sat at the dining room table, focused on her new puzzle. It was an image of a medieval castle, with tall towers and vast gardens, a place that seemed straight out of a fairy tale, so distant from the reality she lived in. Around her, the noise of the other children playing and shouting didn't affect her in the least. Her mind was focused on fitting each piece, on finding its place, just as she tried to do with her own life. The headmistress of the home, Mrs. Carmona, a stout woman with a stern face but a kind heart, watched Sofía from the doorway. She had seen many children pass through that place, but Sofía had always caught her attention. There was something in her eyes, in the way she held herself, that set her apart from the others. Despite her young age, it seemed as if she had experienced more than any child should have. "Sofía," Mrs. Carmona said, approaching with slow, heavy steps. Sofía lifted her gaze from the puzzle, her expression calm but with a spark of curiosity in her eyes. Mrs. Carmona sat beside her with a long sigh, as though each word she was about to speak weighed heavily on her chest. "You know you're very special, right?" She began, in a soft, almost maternal tone, something rare for her. I've always seen you so quiet, so willing to help others, but I also know you carry a lot inside, things you may not have shared with anyone. Sofía nodded slowly but said nothing. She had learned from a young age that words weren't always necessary. Silence could be more powerful than any explanation. It's not fair that a girl like you has to go through all of this, Mrs. Carmona continued, as she looked at the incomplete puzzle. You have a bright future, Sofía. I see it in the way you think, in the way you organize the pieces, as if the world were a big puzzle you're trying to solve. Sofía smiled slightly, but her mind was already far away. She knew Mrs. Carmona wanted to help, but in her heart, there was something even the best intentions couldn't heal. The nights were the hardest. Each time they turned off the lights and the home fell into a deep silence, Sofía would curl up in her small bed, clutching her worn-out teddy bear, the only tangible memory of her past life. It was then that the memories would catch up to her. She would remember her mother, frail and sick, her Aunt Teresa, and that last goodbye in the rain. And above all, she would remember the vague image of her father, a man whose absence had left a void so deep that sometimes it felt like it could never be filled. Thank you, Mrs. Carmona, Sofía finally said, breaking the silence with a voice soft yet firm. But I'm fine. I like being here. I like helping others. Mrs. Carmona looked at her with a mix of admiration and sadness. She knew Sofía was fine materially, but she also knew the girl carried a weight in her heart that no puzzle could fix. You know, Sofía. Mrs. Carmona's voice dropped to a whisper, as if she feared breaking the calm of the moment. Sometimes, we need more than just intelligence and strength to move forward. We need hope. And even though this place isn't perfect, I want you to know that you can always find something good here, something to keep going for. Sofía lowered her gaze to the puzzle. The last piece was in her hand, ready to be placed. Slowly, she fitted into place, completing the image of the castle. But inside, she still felt like something was missing. That last piece, that something she couldn't find within the cold walls of the home or in Mrs. Carmona's kind words. Thank you, Sofía repeated, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Carmona nodded, giving her a gentle pat on the back before standing up. She knew that, despite her youth, Sofía possessed an innate wisdom. But she also knew the girl would face many more challenges before she could find her true place in the world. As the headmistress walked away, Sofía remained seated in silence, staring at the completed image of the castle. She could see the open gates in the distance, the flags waving atop the towers, and for a moment, she wished she could step through those gates. But she knew her life wasn't a fairy tale. The pieces of her own puzzle were much harder to fit, and though she was strong, she knew the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles. However, deep inside, a small flame of hope remained lit. Because just like her puzzle, she knew that one day, all the pieces would find their place. Time passed in the children's home as if each day were a repeat of the last. Cold winters gave way to mild springs, and Sofía grew year by year within the walls of the place that never truly felt like home. By the time she was 13, she was a serious young girl, with a brilliant mind that stood out in every school activity. Her teachers admired her dedication, while the other children, though they respected her, kept a quiet distance, as if they knew Sofía lived in a world different from theirs. One autumn afternoon, when golden leaves swirled in the wind outside the home's gardens, Sofía sat in the small library of the building. It was a cozy space, with shelves full of old books and leather armchairs worn from use. The sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light on the wooden floors. Sofía, as usual, was absorbed in a book on economics, a subject that had fascinated her for as long as she could remember. The theories and concepts of how the world worked gave her a sense of control, a way to understand the mechanisms of a universe that, until then, had been unpredictable and cruel. The library door opened with a soft creak, interrupting the tranquility of the moment. Mrs. Carmona appeared in the doorway, her usual look of concern on her face, though this time there was something else in her eyes, something Sofía couldn't immediately decipher. Sofía, Mrs. Carmona said, with a serious yet affectionate tone, "There's someone who wants to talk to you." Sofía looked up from her book, frowning with curiosity. She closed the book carefully and stood up, following Mrs. Carmona without asking questions. The hallway they walked down was dimly lit, with only a few lights on, giving the place a strange, almost solemn atmosphere. When they reached the main office, a tall and elegant figure was standing by the window. The man, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, turned as he heard the door open. "Sofía, this is Mr. Alvarez," Mrs. Carmona said, gesturing toward the man. "He's one of the directors of a local supermarket chain. He wants to speak to you about a special opportunity." Sophia's heart skipped a beat with excitement, but she kept her face impassive, as she had learned to do. She had worked hard in her studies, especially excelling in mathematics and economics. If Mr. Alvarez was there to offer her an opportunity, it meant that perhaps her efforts were starting to pay off. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Alvarez," Sofía said firmly, extending her hand. The man shook her hand with an approving smile. There was something in the way he looked at her, as if he saw beyond the shy young girl standing before him. "I've heard a lot about you, Sofía," Alvarez began, taking a seat in the small office and indicating that Sofía should do the same. "Your teachers speak highly of your abilities, especially in subjects like economics and management. It's rare to find someone so young with such a passion for these topics." Sofía nodded, maintaining a firm posture. She felt, for the first time, that her talent was being recognized beyond the walls of the children's home. "I'm here because, in our supermarket chain, we value young talent, and especially people like you, who have a clear vision of what they want in life," Alvarez continued, clasping his hands on the table. "We have a training program for young people with potential, and I'm here to offer you a spot." For a moment, time seemed to stop for Sofía. The proposal was exactly what she had dreamed of, a chance to escape the confines of the home, to build a future she had only imagined in her dreams. But at the same time, an uncomfortable thought crossed her mind. "Why me?" she asked, her tone mixing curiosity and suspicion. "There are many brilliant students out there, why choose me?" Mr. Alvarez looked at her for a moment, as if carefully considering his response. "Because I see something in you that goes beyond grades, Sofía," he finally replied. "I see determination, something rare. Someone who has been through hardship and keeps moving forward with their head held high. That's not something you learn in any school." Sofía observed him, still skeptical, but with a glimmer of hope growing inside her. She knew this was her opportunity to break free from the routine, to do something great with her life. "I'm willing to accept the opportunity, Mr. Alvarez," she finally said, with a firmness that surprised even Mrs. Carmona. "I'll do everything I can not to let you down." The man smiled, satisfied with her answer. "I expect nothing less from you, Sofía," he said, rising from his seat. "You'll start at one of our supermarkets in the city next week. It'll be basic jobs at first, but I'm confident that, over time, you'll stand out and move up quickly." Sofía nodded again, her heart racing with excitement. She knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger. As Mr. Alvarez left, Mrs. Carmona placed a hand on her shoulder, looking at her with pride. "You know, Sofía," she said softly, "I always knew you would go far. You're a special girl." Sofía didn't say anything, but inside her, a mix of emotions stirred. The future she had longed for now seemed more real than ever. However, a shadow lingered in her mind, the identity of the owner of that supermarket chain. Though she had never looked too deeply into it, Sofía knew the chain belonged to a man who had built his empire from the ground up. Her instinct told her there was more behind all this, but for the moment, she decided to set aside her suspicions. She had accepted the first step toward her freedom, and she was determined not to let anything stand in her way. The rhythmic beeping of barcode scanners echoed in Sofía's ears as she moved items from one side of the conveyor belt to the other. It had been just over a week since she started working at the supermarket, and although the work was simple and repetitive, she performed it with a meticulous focus, as she did with everything in her life. The supermarket was large, a vast space filled with endless shelves offering everything from food to cleaning products. The bustle of customers, the bright lights, and the constant movement of employees created an atmosphere that, although chaotic, had a strange sense of order for Sofía. Despite her young age, Sofía had already begun to stand out in the tasks she was assigned. It wasn't just because she did her job with dedication, but because her mind was always one step ahead, observing how the entire system functioned, from product distribution to employee scheduling. For her, this wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to learn, to understand the gears behind such a large enterprise. Every time she saw the managers walking down the aisles, holding tablets and talking quietly about sales figures, her mind started to imagine herself, one day, in that position. One afternoon, as she was organizing cleaning supplies on the shelves, she overheard a conversation between two managers standing nearby. Sofía, not wanting to interrupt, continued with her task but couldn't help catching snippets of what they were saying. "The boss is in town this week," one of them said seriously. "He's going to do his rounds at all the stores. He wants to see how things are going." "The boss?" replied the younger, more nervous manager. "Do you mean Daniel Vargas? I've heard so many stories about him. He's like a legend in the business, right?" The first manager nodded slowly. "Yes, he's the owner of all this. Started from scratch, building everything with his own hands. There are rumors that his life wasn't easy, but, well, now he's one of the biggest businessmen in the state. Just make sure everything's spotless when he comes. He doesn't tolerate mistakes." Sofía paused for a moment, her breath catching briefly as she heard that name, Daniel Vargas. It was a name she had heard somewhere before, but she couldn't remember exactly where. However, something stirred inside her, an uncomfortable feeling she couldn't shake. The name seemed to resonate in a deep corner of her memory. She shook her head, trying to focus again on her work. Maybe she was just being paranoid. After all, how many people could be named Daniel Vargas? But as the days passed, that sense of unease continued to grow. A week later, the day arrived. The rumor of the owner's visit had spread throughout the store, and the employees were more tense than usual, making sure every shelf was perfectly aligned, every register running smoothly. The atmosphere was electric, and while many saw it as an opportunity to impress the big boss, for Sofía, there was something more. Her heart raced, and she didn't exactly know why. At 11 a.m., a black car pulled up in front of the main entrance. From inside, a tall, elegant man stepped out, dressed in a dark suit that exuded authority. Daniel Vargas walked with a firm stride, accompanied by two assistants carrying tablets, following closely behind, jotting down everything he mentioned. Sofía, who was behind the cash register at that moment, saw him enter. Her heart skipped a beat when her eyes met his for a fleeting moment. Daniel Vargas didn't seem to notice anything in that brief exchange, but for Sofía, it felt as if time had stopped. There was something about his face, something in the way he moved, that felt strangely familiar, like an echo from the past she had tried to forget. As the store tour continued, Sofía kept her distance, watching how the owner inspected every detail. His presence commanded respect, and his critical gaze seemed to analyze everything with surgical precision. But every now and then, Sofía felt his eyes rest on her, even if just for a second. Time and again, their glances crossed, and each time it happened, an unsettling feeling grew inside her. Finally, as the inspection was coming to an end, Daniel Vargas stopped near the register where Sofía was working. For no apparent reason, he turned toward her, his deep, analytical eyes studying her intently. Sofía, despite the knot in her stomach, maintained her composure and looked directly into his eyes. "What's your name?" Vargas asked, his voice firm but polite. "Sofía." "Sofía Vargas," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly as she spoke her last name, the same one he carried. For a brief moment, Daniel Vargas seemed frozen, as if her words had struck something inside him that he wasn't expecting. His eyes, which had been cold and calculating throughout the tour, showed for a second something different, a mix of surprise, confusion, and something else Sofía couldn't immediately identify. But quickly, Vargas regained his composure, nodding with a slight, forced smile. "Good job, Sofía," he said in a neutral tone before continuing his tour. Sofía stood there, watching him walk away. Her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the register. Something had shifted in that moment, and although she couldn't fully explain it, she knew it wasn't a coincidence. The name, the way he had looked at her, everything pointed to a truth that had remained hidden for many years. The past was about to catch up with her, and though she didn't know how or when, a part of her was ready to face it. Night had fallen over the city, and the supermarket was almost deserted. As usual, Sofía stayed a bit later after her shift to help organize the shelves and make sure everything was in order. Her mind, however, was far from the products she was stocking. The words of Daniel Vargas echoed in her head, over and over again, along with the way he had looked at her. That feeling of familiarity still pulsed in her chest, as if she were on the verge of discovering something that would change her life forever. "Good job, Sofía." The phrase seemed simple, but she couldn't stop analyzing every inflection in his voice, every small gesture. Why had he stopped to speak with her? Why had his eyes shown that mix of emotions for just a brief moment? As she placed the items on the shelves, she felt the weight of those questions growing heavier and heavier. The supermarket was closed to the public when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw one of the managers approaching quickly. "Sofía," the man said, with a slightly nervous tone. "Mr. Vargas wants to see you in his office." Sofía felt a chill run down her spine. There was no reason for the owner of the chain to want to speak with such a low-level employee, unless... The questions that had plagued her for days began to take the shape of concrete suspicions. Nodding, she followed the manager down the empty aisles to a discreet door that led to the administrative offices. When the door opened, she found Daniel Vargas sitting behind a polished wooden desk, his jacket draped over the back of the chair. Papers were scattered in front of him, but as he saw her enter, he set everything aside and looked at her intently, as if trying to unravel an impossible puzzle. "Sofía, please, have a seat," Vargas said, gesturing to a chair in front of him. Sofía sat down, keeping her outward calm, though inside her heart was pounding. She didn't know what to expect from this conversation, but the intensity of the moment kept her alert, as if every word could change the course of her life. For a moment, Daniel Vargas said nothing. He simply observed her, as if searching for answers in her face. Finally, he took a deep breath and leaned slightly forward. "You have the same last name as me," he began, his tone curious, not accusatory. "Do you know how many years I've been in this business? I've seen many employees come and go, but I've never met anyone who reminded me so much of something I thought I'd lost." Sofía felt the world around her grow smaller. The pieces of the puzzle she had tried to put together in her mind seemed to be falling into place, but not in the way she had expected. "My last name is Vargas," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I don't know if it means anything. I never met my father, all I know is that he left me when I was little." The words hung in the air like a confession that had waited years to be spoken. Daniel Vargas furrowed his brow, his face hardened by years of difficult decisions. But behind that impenetrable facade, something else was breaking through. "How old are you, Sofía?" he asked, his voice lower now, as if the weight of the answer was too much for him to bear. 21, she said, noticing the slight tremble in her own voice. Despite the calm she tried to project, she couldn't stop a surge of emotions from taking over. "My mother died when I was 3. I don't know much more about my past, except that my aunt left me in a children's home." Daniel Vargas closed his eyes for a moment, resting his hands on the edge of the desk. He could feel how the threads of his life, which he had tried to keep separate for so many years, were beginning to intertwine into an unavoidable truth. When he opened his eyes again, there was no doubt left in his gaze. "It can't be a coincidence," he murmured, almost to himself. He stood slowly and walked toward the window, looking out at the lit-up city. "Many years ago, I made a mistake I could never escape. I left someone behind, a little girl, with a mother who couldn't care for her. I thought I was doing the right thing at the time, but the regret has followed me ever since." Sofía remained silent, her hands clenched in her lap. She could feel the tension in the room becoming unbearable, as every word that left Vargas's mouth brought them closer to a truth they both feared. "Why did you do it?" Sofía finally asked, her voice breaking for the first time. The emotions she had kept bottled up for so long now overflowed. "Why did you leave me?" Daniel turned slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and pain that he had suppressed for years. There was no simple answer, and he knew it. All he could offer was a truth that he had tried to bury beneath years of success and money. "I didn't know how to handle it," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "Your mother, she was in a bad place, and I was young, selfish. I thought that by walking away, I could save myself. But I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped wondering what happened to you." Sofía felt the tears burning her eyes, but she held them back. She didn't want to appear vulnerable, didn't want him to see her break. But the truth was too powerful, and she had waited so long to confront this moment. "You abandoned me," she said, her voice trembling as the words spilled out like a torrent. "And you left me alone. You had no right to come looking for me now, after everything I went through." Daniel looked at her with deep sorrow, fully understanding the magnitude of his actions. There were no excuses, only the weight of a life filled with wrong decisions. "You're right," he admitted, bowing his head. "I don't have the right. But here I am, and the only thing I can do is ask for your forgiveness, and offer you what I could never give you before, a family, if you can ever bring yourself to forgive me." Sofía stared at him, her emotions in turmoil. Part of her wanted to scream, to leave, to let him remain with his regrets. But another part of her, the little girl who had been abandoned, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be some redemption in all of this. "It's not that easy to forgive," she said, her voice shaky. "But I don't know if I can keep hating you either." Daniel looked at her, the vulnerability in his expression clear, but also the acceptance that he might never get the forgiveness he sought. "I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want you to know that I'm here now. And that, even if it's late, I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make up for the time we lost. But I'm not asking you to do this for me, do it for yourself, if you choose to." The silence that followed those words was thick, almost tangible. Sofía felt a lump form in her throat, a mix of emotions she couldn't control. A part of her wanted to get up and walk away, leaving him to his guilt. But another part, deep inside, longed to hold on to the hope that he truly regretted what he had done. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you," Sofía finally admitted, her voice soft but firm. "But I'm not ready to keep hating you, either." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and pain. He knew that the wounds he had caused would not heal overnight, but he also understood that the small step Sofía had taken was more than he had expected. "That's enough for me, Sofía," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "And I'll be here, waiting for as long as you need." Sofía rose slowly, feeling that she had taken a step towards something she couldn't fully define but that brought her a strange sense of relief. As she left the office, part of her still wrestled with the emotions she had carried for years, but at least now she knew she wasn't facing them alone. Scene 10, Rebuilding the Bonds. The weeks that followed the conversation in the office were a period of transition for both Sofía and Daniel. While forgiveness hadn't come immediately, something had changed between them. The tension that had once been unbearable in their interactions was now softer, though the silences between them were still long and heavy. Sofía continued her work at the supermarket, dedicating herself to every task with the same meticulousness as always, but now she felt that the future was no longer a straight, inevitable line. There were new possibilities, though the path toward them remained uncertain. One day, while Sofía was busy managing inventory, reviewing records on her tablet, Daniel approached her. Unlike previous encounters, his presence was unannounced and unceremonious. He seemed more casual, almost humble. He wore a long gray coat, his hands in his pockets. Sofía noticed him from a distance, and although her first instinct was to retreat, something inside her urged her to remain calm. "How's the inventory going?" Daniel asked, trying to break the ice with a simple question, though they both knew what he really wanted to talk about had nothing to do with numbers. Sofía looked up from her tablet and nodded slightly. "It's going well. There are some discrepancies in the sales figures for this week, but I'm already working on correcting them," she replied professionally, though she couldn't help feeling the familiar discomfort of the pending conversation between them. Daniel nodded, but he didn't continue with the subject of inventory. Instead, he stood silently for a few seconds, as if debating internally how to approach what he really wanted to say. "Sofía," he began more gently, "I've been thinking a lot about everything I told you that night, about what I did, about the choices I made. And I know there's nothing I can do to undo the past. But I'd like to do something for you. I want to give you more opportunities here, in the company. You're brilliant, I see it every day." Sofía listened attentively, not interrupting. She knew what he was offering wasn't just a promotion or a raise. It was his way of trying to make amends, to build a connection through what they both understood, work and effort. "I'm not asking you to accept this as compensation for the past," Daniel continued sincerely. "I just want you to know that if you choose to stay, if you choose to move forward, I'm here to support you. Not because I feel obligated, but because I believe in you, in your abilities, in what you can achieve." Sofía remained silent for a few moments, weighing his words. She had spent her entire life proving to herself that she didn't need anyone. But now, faced with the possibility of receiving help, not just from a mentor or a boss, but from her own father, she felt a complex mix of emotions she couldn't easily understand. "It's hard for me to trust you, Daniel," she finally said, using his name for the first time. He noticed the detail, and it didn't go unnoticed by either of them. "For years, I've worked to prove to myself that I don't need anyone. And now you show up, offering me help. I'm not sure how to feel about that." Daniel nodded, accepting her words without reproach. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," he replied with the honesty that was difficult for him. "I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going to disappear again. I want to be part of your life, in whatever way you choose." Sofía looked down at the tablet in her hands, feeling the weight of the decision she had in front of her. She had spent so much time building walls around her emotions that opening a door, even a small one, terrified her. But at the same time, a part of her longed for a real connection, something that went beyond figures and inventories. "I can think about it," she finally said, lifting her gaze to meet his eyes. It wasn't a full acceptance, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was a small step, but a significant one. Daniel nodded, and for the first time in a long while, he let a sincere smile cross his face, a smile that seemed to ease the tension in his features. "That's all I ask," he said softly. In the following days, their interactions became more frequent, though still cautious. Daniel, true to his word, never pressured Sofía to accept a closer relationship. Instead, he remained available, offering her work opportunities that Sofía saw not as favors but as challenges she was determined to overcome on her own merit. For her part, Sofía began to open up, little by little. The barriers she had built over the years didn't fall down overnight, but slowly, she allowed a few cracks to form. She accepted the possibility that, maybe, there could be something beyond resentment and bitterness in her relationship with Daniel. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for forgiveness. One afternoon, as they both reviewed sales reports in the office, Daniel observed her silently for a few seconds before speaking. "You know, I've realized how much you resemble your mother," he said with a melancholy smile. She had the same determination, the same strength of character. Sofía tensed for a moment at the mention of her mother but didn't pull away from the conversation. Inside her, a mix of curiosity and pain began to surface. "I don't remember her well," she admitted, without taking her eyes off the reports. "I only have small fragments, her laughter, her voice. But those memories are blurry, like they belong to another life." Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of what she was feeling. "She was an incredible woman," he continued, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She went through a lot of things I couldn't understand at the time. I made many mistakes, but I never doubted how much she loved you. I believe that, if she had been stronger, things would have been different." Sofía took a deep breath, feeling how those words stirred old wounds. But instead of pulling away, she decided to face them. "It's hard to imagine how things would have been if they had been different," she said, her tone soft but firm. "But all I can do now is move forward. What I want to know is, if you're ready to be here for what comes next. Because I don't want to feel alone in this again." Daniel looked at her seriously, his eyes showing a mix of emotion and determination. "I'm here, Sofía," he said with certainty that he hadn't shown before. "And I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Sofía felt that those words carried real weight. Though the pain of the past still lingered, the first step toward reconciliation had been taken. She knew that the path toward full forgiveness would be long, but for the first time in years, she wouldn't walk it alone. The cold winter wind blew through the streets as Sofía made her way to her Aunt Teresa's small house. It had been years since she last saw her, and although she had never felt a strong connection with her aunt, she knew this meeting was inevitable. Ever since she had begun to rebuild her relationship with Daniel, questions about her past had become more pressing. And the only person who could give her the answers she sought was Teresa. Sofía hadn't spoken to her aunt since she left the children's home. She knew that Teresa had continued with her life, always distant, never getting too involved in her niece's life. But now, after so many years, Sofía felt it was time to confront the loose ends, to understand the reasons behind the decisions that had shaped her childhood. She arrived in front of Teresa's house, a small dwelling with a facade worn by time, with windows that hinted at a solitary, routine life. The garden was unkempt, with dry plants and leaves piled up from the fall. Taking a deep breath, Sofía raised her hand and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, she heard soft footsteps, and finally, the door opened. Teresa, although older, still looked like the thin, serious woman Sofía remembered. Her face bore the marks of the years, but her expression was the same as always, a mixture of distance and resignation. "Sofía," Teresa said in a tone of surprise, though not of warmth. "I didn't expect to see you here." Sofía nodded slightly, not expecting this meeting to be easy. "I need to talk to you, Aunt," she said, maintaining a respectful but firm tone. "There are a lot of things from the past that I never understood. And I think it's time you explained them to me." Teresa observed her in silence for a moment, as if evaluating whether she was ready for that conversation. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Teresa's house was as austere as Sofía remembered. There were few decorations, functional furniture, and nothing that indicated a joyful life lived within those walls. The place smelled of old tea and the coldness of a solitary existence. Teresa led her to the small living room, where they sat facing each other. "Tell me, Sofía," Teresa finally said, clasping her hands in her lap. "What is it that you want to know?" Sofía took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her chest as she searched for the right words. "I want to know why you left me in that children's home," she said, looking her aunt directly in the eyes. "I want to understand why you never came back for me, why you abandoned me when you knew I had no one else." Teresa looked at her intently, and for a moment, Sofía could see the deep weariness in her eyes. It was a weariness not just from age but from the weight of guilt she had perhaps never expressed. "I never meant to abandon you, Sofía," Teresa said softly, her voice gentler than Sofía expected. "But at that time, I had no other choice. I could barely take care of myself. I was living on the edge, and I couldn't give you the life you deserved. I thought that in a home, you'd be better cared for. I didn't want to drag you down with me in my own misery. Teresa's words hit Sofía in an unexpected way. She had always viewed her aunt as distant, someone who simply hadn't cared enough. But now, seeing the pain behind her expression, she began to realize the story was more complicated than she had imagined. I didn't know. Sofía murmured, processing Teresa's confession. I always thought you just didn't want me. Teresa lowered her gaze, her face more fragile than Sofía remembered. It wasn't that, Sofía. Of course, I cared about you. But I was young, and I was trapped in a life I didn't know how to handle. Your mother was gone, and I had nothing, emotionally or financially, to offer you. I thought that if you were at least in a place where they could take care of you, you'd have a better chance than what I could give you. Sofía felt a lump in her throat as she listened to those words. She had spent her whole life building a wall of resentment toward Teresa, but now that wall was starting to crack. She knew that, while her aunt's decisions had not been the right ones, they had been based on a desperation she hadn't seen before. I understand that it wasn't easy, Sofía said, her voice softer now. But I felt so alone, Aunt. And you never came back for me. Teresa nodded slowly, her face showing a mixture of sadness and resignation. You're right, Sofía. I didn't come back, because I was afraid. Afraid of facing what I had done, afraid of seeing what you had become without me. And deep down, I felt guilty for not being able to save you from that situation. I thought you deserved better than what I could offer, and in the end, I just disappeared. Sofía let out a long sigh, feeling the emotions swirling inside her. She had sought this confrontation for years, but now that it was happening, she realized it wasn't anger that filled her but a deep sadness. Sadness for what she had lost, and for what both she and her aunt had lost. I wanted answers, she finally said, but I didn't expect them to be this hard to hear. Teresa nodded in silence, understanding the weight of Sofía's words. For a long moment, both women sat in silence, processing the shared pain of years of misunderstanding and abandonment. Finally, Teresa broke the silence. I'm sorry I wasn't what you needed, Sofía, she said, with a sincerity Sofía hadn't expected. And I know it's too late to fix things. But I want you to know that I've always thought about you, even if I didn't do the right thing. Sofía looked at her, feeling for the first time in years a flicker of compassion for her aunt. She knew the past couldn't be changed, but she also knew that holding on to the anger wouldn't take her anywhere. I don't know if I can forgive you for everything, she said, her voice firm but not cold. But I appreciate your honesty. That's more than I expected. Teresa smiled weakly, as if a small burden had been lifted from her heart. That's more than I deserve, she whispered. Sofía stood up slowly, feeling that this conversation, although painful, had been necessary. As she headed toward the door, Teresa called softly after her. Sofía, she said hesitantly. If you ever want to come back, I'll be here. Sofía turned and gave a small smile. Thank you, Aunt, she said before stepping outside. As she walked back through the cold streets, Sofía felt that something inside her had shifted. The weight of the past was still there, but now she carried it with a little more understanding. And although her relationship with Teresa would never be perfect, that small step toward reconciliation was enough for now. The air was thick with expectation as Sofía walked through the supermarket aisles, but this time, it wasn't just another shift. After her meeting with Teresa, Sofía had begun to close several chapters in her life. The answers she had sought for so long were finally within reach. Though not everything was resolved, something had shifted within her. She had found a way to start making peace with her past, but there remained one final step, Daniel. Daniel Vargas had respected her space, giving her time to process everything that had been happening. While their interactions had remained short and professional, the bond between them was still there, lingering in every conversation. Sofía knew that sooner or later, she would have to face the question of forgiveness, to decide whether she could or should fully open herself to the idea of having her father back in her life. That afternoon, Daniel had invited her to meet him in the office by the store's warehouse. He hadn't given many details, just an invitation, but Sofía knew that the conversation they were about to have would be crucial. It was the last chapter she needed to close before she could decide which direction to take. When she reached the office, the door was slightly ajar. She knocked softly before entering, and there he was, seated behind his desk, his expression calm yet tense. Upon seeing her, Daniel stood and gave a slight smile. "Sofía, thank you for coming," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of emotion she could sense. Sofía nodded and took a seat across from him. The silence between them was palpable, not uncomfortable, but laden with meaning. Daniel sat back down, crossing his hands on the table as if trying to find the right way to start. "I know we've come a long way since we first met in this store," Daniel began softly. "And I also know I haven't done right by you for most of your life. But I want you to know that I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be your father. I don't want to force anything on you, Sofía. I don't want to impose my wishes on you. I just want you to make whatever decision brings you peace." Sofía listened intently, her eyes fixed on him. For so long, she had been searching for the peace Daniel spoke of. She had thought that the only way to find it was by keeping him at a distance, but now, sitting in front of him, she realized that true peace would only come from facing what they both shared. "Daniel," she began, using his name as she had always done since they met. "I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why you left me, why you never came back for me. I spent so long being resentful, angry, because I felt like you had failed me in a way that couldn't be fixed. But after everything we've talked about, I've realized something." Daniel watched her in silence, his expression tense but expectant. Sofía took a deep breath before continuing. "I realize that holding on to that anger won't get me anywhere. And while I can't tell you that I've fully forgiven you," her voice softened, "I'm willing to try. I'm willing to open myself to the possibility that we can build something new. I don't know what it will look like, but I want to try." Sofía's words hung in the air, and for a moment, Daniel didn't know how to respond. The emotion on his face was clear, but it seemed he was struggling to hold back his feelings. "You have no idea how much it means to me to hear that, Sofía," he finally said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I don't take it for granted. But if you give me this chance, I'll do everything in my power not to let you down again." Sofía nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The emotional weight she had carried for so many years suddenly felt lighter. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that the path to a true relationship with Daniel would be full of obstacles, but for the first time in her life, she was willing to try. "It's not going to be easy," she warned, with a small smile. "There's a lot we'll need to work on. But I think I'm ready to try." Daniel smiled too, a genuine smile, one that seemed to ease the tension in his face for the first time. "I don't expect it to be easy," he replied. "But I'm here, and I'm ready to walk that path with you, step by step." A comfortable silence settled between them, not the kind of silence that made them uneasy, but one that spoke of mutual understanding. Sofía felt that, for the first time, she wasn't alone in her journey, and that she had found a space where her past and her present could begin to coexist. "How about we go out to dinner tonight?" Daniel asked, with a slight smile. "I think we deserve a little celebration for this new beginning." Sofía laughed softly and nodded. "That sounds good," she said. "But I get to pick the place." "Deal," Daniel replied with a chuckle. As they both stood and prepared to leave, Sofía felt a calmness that she hadn't experienced in a long time. She knew that forgiveness was a long process, that there would be difficult moments, but she also knew that for the first time in years, she was ready to open herself up to the love she had been avoiding for so long. The past wouldn't disappear, but it no longer carried the same weight. And with that, Sofía knew she had taken the first step toward the peace she had been searching for. The cold wind blew across the street as Sofía made her way to her Aunt Teresa's small house once again. Her steps were slower, more deliberate this time, as if she were preparing herself for what was to come. Ever since her first conversation with Teresa, something inside her had changed. The pieces of her past had begun to fit together, although not in the way she had expected. But there was still more she needed to confront, one last chapter in the long story of her life. The small house looked the same as the last time, its worn facade and neglected garden unchanged by time. Sofía hesitated for a moment before ringing the doorbell. She wasn't sure how this conversation would unfold, but she knew it was necessary to move forward. Teresa opened the door after a few seconds, her expression showing a mix of surprise and nervousness. She hadn't expected Sofía to return so soon. "Sofía," Teresa said, stepping aside to let her in, her voice a bit softer than before. "I didn't expect to see you again." Sofía stepped inside and gave a small nod. The house was as austere as she remembered, its cold atmosphere only broken by the faint smell of tea and a hint of something burning in the fireplace. "I need to talk to you," Sofía began, her tone firm but calm. "There are things I need to understand about my past, and about you." Teresa nodded, motioning for Sofía to sit. They both sat down in the small, quiet living room, and for a moment, neither spoke. "What do you want to know?" Teresa finally asked, her eyes showing the weariness of someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long. Sofía took a deep breath, preparing herself for the conversation she had been putting off for years. "I want to know why you didn't come back for me after you left me in the children's home," Sofía said, her voice steady despite the emotions welling up inside her. "I want to know why you never explained what happened to me, why I grew up believing I was abandoned by everyone." Teresa remained silent for a long time, her eyes dropping to the floor as she processed Sofía's words. Finally, with a heavy sigh, she began to speak. "I didn't come back because I didn't think I could give you what you needed," Teresa admitted quietly. "After your mother died, I was lost, Sofía. I didn't know how to take care of myself, let alone a child. I thought that leaving you in the home was the best thing I could do for you, even though I knew how much it would hurt." Sofía's heart ached as she listened to Teresa's words, realizing for the first time just how much pain and guilt her aunt had carried with her all these years. Still, the explanation didn't take away the hurt of feeling abandoned. "But you never told me any of that," Sofía said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of her own emotions. "You just disappeared from my life, and I grew up thinking I wasn't worth coming back for." Teresa lifted her gaze, her eyes filled with regret. "I know I should have explained things to you," she admitted. "But I was ashamed, Sofía. I didn't want to face you because I felt like I had failed you, just like I failed your mother. And every day that passed, it became harder and harder to come back. I thought you'd be better off without me, and I convinced myself that staying away was the best choice." Sofía felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. She had spent years resenting Teresa, believing she hadn't cared enough to return. But now she saw that her aunt's absence had been driven by guilt and fear, rather than indifference. "It wasn't easy for me either," Sofía said, her voice quiet but steady. "I needed someone, and you were all I had left. But instead of trying to make things right, you stayed away, and I had to grow up on my own." "I know, and I'm sorry," Teresa said, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. "I wish I could go back and do things differently. But I can't. All I can do now is ask for your forgiveness, even though I don't deserve it." Sofía sat in silence, letting her aunt's words sink in. She wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive Teresa completely, but she knew that holding on to her anger wouldn't heal the wounds of the past. "I don't know if I can forgive everything right now," Sofía admitted honestly. "But I'm willing to try to understand. That's all I can offer right now." Teresa nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning," something she hadn't dared hope for. "Thank you, Sofía," Teresa whispered. "That means more than you know." For the first time in years, Sofía felt a sense of closure, even if it was only partial. She didn't know if her relationship with Teresa could ever be fully repaired, but she was willing to take the first step toward healing. As Sofía stood to leave, Teresa called after her softly. "Sofía, if you ever want to come back, my door is always open." Sofía turned and gave her aunt a small, genuine smile. It was a fragile moment of reconciliation, but it was enough for now. "I'll keep that in mind," she said before stepping out into the cold winter air. The conversation with Teresa had been difficult, but Sofía felt lighter now that she had faced the past head-on. With each passing day, she felt more at peace with the difficult choices that had shaped her life. She knew there were still many things left unresolved, but she also knew she wasn't facing them alone anymore. Her relationship with Daniel had become more open and honest, though they both understood that rebuilding trust would take time. Their interactions at the supermarket were now more frequent, though still cautious, as if both were testing the waters of what could become a stronger bond. One evening, as Sofía was preparing to leave after her shift, Daniel approached her. He looked more relaxed than usual, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Sofía, I was wondering if you'd like to join me for dinner tonight," he said, his tone hopeful but not pushy. "We can talk about anything you want, or nothing at all. Just, spend some time together." Sofía hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded. "Sure, I'd like that," she replied with a smile. As they walked out of the supermarket together, Sofía realized that while the past still held a powerful grip on her emotions, she had begun to loosen its hold. She didn't know what the future would bring for her and Daniel, or even for her and Teresa, but she knew that she was finally ready to take control of her own life. And for the first time in a long while, Sofía felt hope, not for what had been lost, but for what could still be found. That evening's conversation in the office was unlike any other. Sofía had come with the intention of finally confronting her feelings and closing the loose ends that still lingered in her relationship with Daniel. It had been a long journey, full of doubts and resentment, but as she sat across from him, she felt an unexpected calm. Daniel watched her from behind his desk, his expression composed yet tense. He knew this conversation would be crucial, not just for him, but for the future of his relationship with Sofía. After a moment of silence, he decided to break the tension. "I know we've come a long way since we first met here," Daniel began softly. "And I also know I haven't done right by you for most of your life. But I want you to know I've been thinking a lot about what it really means to be your father. I don't want to force anything on you, Sofía. I don't want to impose my wishes on you. I just want you to make whatever decision brings you peace." Sofía listened attentively, her eyes fixed on him. For so long, she had been searching for the peace Daniel was speaking of. She had thought the only way to find it was by keeping him at a distance, but now, sitting in front of him, she realized that true peace could only come from confronting what they both shared. "Daniel," she began, using his name as she always had since they met, "I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why you left me, why you never came back for me. I spent so long being resentful, angry, because I felt like you had failed me in a way that couldn't be fixed. But after everything we've talked about, I've realized something." Daniel watched her closely, his expression tense but expectant. Sofía took a deep breath before continuing. "I realize that holding on to that anger isn't going to get me anywhere. And while I can't tell you that I've fully forgiven you," her voice softened, "I'm willing to try. I'm willing to open myself to the possibility that we can build something new. I don't know what that looks like, but I want to try." Her words lingered in the air, and for a moment, Daniel didn't know how to respond. The emotion in his face was clear, but he seemed to struggle to contain it. "You don't know how much it means to me to hear that, Sofía," he finally said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not taking it for granted. But if you give me this chance, I'll do everything I can to never let you down again." Sofía nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The emotional weight she had carried for so many years suddenly felt lighter. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that the path to a true relationship with Daniel would be full of obstacles, but for the first time in her life, she was willing to try. "It's not going to be easy," she warned, a small smile tugging at her lips. "There's a lot we need to work on. But I think I'm ready to try." Daniel smiled too, a genuine smile that seemed to ease the tension in his face for the first time. "I don't expect it to be easy," he replied. "But I'm here, and I'm ready to walk that path with you, step by step." A comfortable silence settled between them, not the kind of silence that felt awkward, but one filled with mutual understanding. Sofía realized that, for the first time, she wasn't alone in her journey. She had found a space where her past and her present could coexist without clashing. "How about we go out for dinner tonight?" Daniel asked, with a slight smile. "I think we deserve a little celebration for this new beginning." Sofía laughed softly and nodded. "That sounds good," she said. "But I get to pick the place." "Deal," Daniel said with a chuckle. As they both stood and prepared to leave, Sofía felt a calm she hadn't experienced in years. She knew that forgiveness was a long process, that there would be difficult moments, but she also knew that, for the first time in years, she was ready to open herself up to the love she had been avoiding for so long. The past wouldn't disappear, but it no longer carried the same weight. And with that, Sofía knew she had taken the first step toward the peace she had been searching for.